dear Mr. President Stock, dear colleagues, dear guests, on behalf of the Board of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and in my own name, let me welcome you most cordially here at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. It is a particular honor and responsibility for us to host ALLEA 2018 General Assembly and accompanying scientific conferences in a period which is extremely important for us, because you know that we are also responsible for the presidency of the Council of the European Union of the first half of this year. The Bulgarian Academy of Sciences is the leading scientific and expert center of Bulgaria. It carries out research and training activities of national and international significance and helps resolving major problems related to the development of the society of our country. The mission of Bulgarian Academy of Sciences is to conduct research in accordance with universal values, national traditions and interests, to participate to the development of the world science, to study and multiply the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of our country. We live in an ever-changing world and face a number of challenges, and that is why we look very seriously at the need to respect the principles set out in the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity: reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability. Academies have traditions in being independent, impartial, and trusted brokers of knowledge. As proponents of evidence-based reasoning, but also as institutions affected by these changes, the academies should get more involved in the debate of this type of challenges that they are facing. Let me just give as examples such important issues which ALLEA addresses recently, like protection of multinational inventions or proposals for transdisciplinarity missions in the forthcoming, in the next framework program of the European Union. Therefore, I believe that the discussions in the three main panels today, the loss of trust in science, the nature of science and knowledge production, the changing landscapes communications, will be extremely useful and up to date. I have no doubt that the discussion during today's symposium will contribute to the formulating clear statement and to preparing the materials for the final publication under the project. And I wish a success to the work of the symposium. I wish also a success of the other conferences, and particularly to the General Assembly of ALLEA and tomorrow's conference of SAPEA. Good luck and welcome to Sofia and to Bulgaria.
So, thank you. Dear Professor Rewalski, dear Professor Stock, dear guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be here today and to have the opportunity to address on behalf of the Bulgarian Presidency of the Council of the European Union and the Ministry of Education and Science the important challenges and opportunities facing the great digital transformation of the European society and economy today, and the role of the European academies in this process. This year is crucial in terms of the Commission's proposals proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework, which can be summarized as a bigger budget for a smaller, more ambitious European Union, Horizon Europe, which also began during the Bulgarian presidency. A modern and flexible budget is needed to support Europe's fundamental values, peace, security, and prosperity in the digital age, boldly focused on the European added value and complex common challenges. The Bulgarian presidency puts a strong emphasis on the discussions for the next framework program based on the increased impact of research results, transfer of knowledge, and excellence. An important element is the focus on strategic areas such as digital single market, where the potential of broad and free access to publications and data can be maximized, including through the European Open Science Cloud data. The globalized, interconnected nature of our economy and society is in the great need of the smooth transition to a common digital European ecosystem. Local and regional partnership are one of the main pillars of this organic ecosystem. The ongoing digital transformation needs to be controlled without compromising society's security, stability, trust, and values. Advanced technologies and new businesses will require more and more highly qualified people, including data specialists and data scientists. Automation and diffusion of advanced digital technologies will further increase productivity and create new economic opportunities. The European research infrastructures should develop an integrated and trusted high-quality data system and related businesses models, taking fully into account ethical issues. Responsible data scientists will contribute to the willingness of citizens to accept the conclusions and decisions taken on the basis of data analysis. Digital connectivity is a key enabling for digitalized economy, creating growth and fostering access to research data and results. Our intention as a presidency will be to work on the transfer of knowledge as the fifth freedom of the European Union, an initiative launched by the European Council in 2008. The role of open science should not be underestimated in these processes. The implementation and further development of advanced solutions for the effective provision and use of high-quality scientific data with effective description and implementing of results and full implementation, the so-called FAIR principles. Open science data, however, should be viewed in context, not only collecting, storing, and sharing, but analyzing, interpreting, and dealing with complex data is extremely important. You may know that for now, there is measure which is called peak performance for supercomputers. But we strongly believe that this measure is not enough. It's very important to be able to measure also the efficiency of the computational power, not only in supercomputers, but also in other computational infrastructures. So I believe we, the scientists, policymakers, and politicians have the responsibility to adequately respond to these new age challenges by re-establishing public's trust in science, by providing science-based policies, there is no real alternative to that. Thus, the European academies should step up their effort in communicating their results and policies, advances to public and politicians. And I strongly believe that this policy of educating policymakers is extremely important for Europe. In such a way, we will do our best to have more efficient and more effective results in all areas of the life. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome today all the participants to All European Academies Conference. I would like to express my special thanks to Professor Stock and Professor Rewalski for all the effort in organization of this conference. The academies and researchers need to acknowledge their role in the functioning of state and society in sharing the future. I wish you very fruitful discussion and very important and in your important timely topics. So thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dear President Rewalski, esteemed Deputy Minister Dimov, let me thank you and give you our best wishes for the intentions, for the valuable intentions you presented during the leadership here in the next couple of months. And I hope that you will succeed. And I also hope for us scientists that you can convey the message that science, of course, is not everything. But most of the things we do without science will not work. So good luck for what you have in mind. Thank you very much. Dear delegates of the ALLEA Academies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends in the board of ALLEA, dear colleagues from the Bulgarian Academies, and especially dear Nikolai. Before we start, ladies and gentlemen, diving into the debate around exciting questions of trust in science in our modern age, I would like to extend my well wishes on behalf of ALLEA to all of you in attendance today. The symposia today and tomorrow, as well as our Madame de Stael Prize Award ceremony in honor of Professor Andrea Pető tonight, will surely provide an intellectually stimulating and enriching setting for this 2018 ALLEA General Assembly. We are very fortunate to be here today at the very kind invitation of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences to host President Professor Rewalski and his members of staff. We owe our sincerest gratitude for their tireless work and support in the organization of this event. Without their efforts, we would not have been able to welcome you all here in this marvelous building. Therefore, a big thank to you, our hosts. You make us feel at home. This is also the moment to say thanks to our partners of this event, the municipality of Sofia, the Ministry of Education and Science, the Bulgarian presidency of the EU Council, and as you heard already, Mr. Dumov has addressed you and given us his thoughts about the next couple of months. I would also like to welcome and thank all of our speakers at today's symposium on Science in Times of Challenged Trust and Expertise. They have traveled from far and wide to be here with us today, and I'm particularly looking forward to this symposium as it is organized by our youngest ALLEA working group on truth, trust, and expertise, which really is tackling some of the most important questions of our time surrounding very fundamental issues on the future role of science in public discourse. Particularly how scientists present themselves and convey their ideas in the digital world without being overshadowed or outmuscled by our latest foe, the fake news. Most of you here will already know what ALLEA is and what we are all about, but for those not yet in the know, allow me to briefly introduce our association. ALLEA, All European Academies, is the European Federation of Academies of Science and Humanities. Currently, our membership comprises 59 academies from over 40 countries. Our membership exceeds the boundaries of the European Union, as we are of the conviction that Europe is more than just a political union. All of our member academies are prominent research institutions or learned societies within their countries, though many have reputations that go far beyond their national borders. In ALLEA, we seek to bring together the accomplished scientists from those academies to work together in a transnational and interdisciplinary fashion on topics with relevance to science, policy, and society. Science for policy, policy for science. Bringing our scientists who have both a good overview and a vision of what needs to be done to improve the European research area from a legislative perspective is an important part of ALLEA's mission. To this effect, ALLEA's working groups produce excellent papers on the framework conditions of science in what we call, in this case, policy for science. It is our explicit aim to ensure that science and research in Europe is carried out in the most independent yet well-supported environment possible. Another pillar of ALLEA's work is the promotion of intellectual excellence and diversity, which we find in such abundance in Europe. To appropriately honor outstanding scholars who, with their work, contribute to the academic scholarship on European identity regarding its many facets, be they social, political, economic, judicial, or the like, we introduced now in its 5th edition the ALLEA Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values. This year's laureate, and you will hear more of her tonight, is a particularly outstanding choice, if I do say so myself. Professor Andrea Petto encourages us to reflect on the role of gendered history and the role of women and gender during historically transformative events such as Holocaust, but also in our modern time. We are very grateful for her to be with us today when she will receive the award from the hands of the European Commissioner for Digital Economy and Society, Maria Gabriel. The prize is made possible with the very kind support of the Compagnia di Sao Paulo, and their contribution is very much appreciated indeed. Tomorrow's symposium on shaping European science advice, insights, and experiences will bring together many fascinating speakers from the European science policy interface to discuss the benefits and challenges of science-based policy advice. This symposium came to be in cooperation with ALLEA's 4 partners in the Academy Networks project SAPIA, Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, which many of you will have heard a lot about already. In tomorrow's symposium, and indeed in the project as a whole, academies are at the forefront of responding to some of the most urgent policy questions in Europe with a wide-ranging impact on virtually all aspects of our societies. With this in mind, I am calling on all our academies to get involved. Many of you already are, but the more participation and exchange of knowledge we get, the better it is. It is now my great pleasure to introduce one of the co-chairs of the aforementioned Working Group on Truth, Trust and Expertise, and simultaneously your guide through today's program. ALLEA's very own Vice President Ed Nord. Ed, take the floor, please. Thank you very much. I'm looking for my glasses. Do you see my glasses?
No. Yes? Okay. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, it has been a good tradition to combine ALLEA's General Assembly with a scientific symposium. Most times we chose a subject related to science, the management of large data corpora, enabling early career researchers, 15 years of the Lisbon Agenda, the freedom of scientific research. Our symposium today touches upon a problem that involves not only science, but our societies as a whole. In recent times, we learned new expressions like alternative facts, fake news, fake media, and influential people stated that science is only an opinion. Political and societal developments and the present image of science gave us the theme for today's symposium: Science in Times of Challenged Trust and Expertise. This symposium and its theme is related to the establishment of a new international working group of ALLEA on truth, trust and expertise. The working group aims at an interrogation and exploration of the current and past dynamics of public trust and the challenges it faces in times of contested norms regarding what counts as truth, facts, and evidence. We agreed to convene 3 thematic workshops in 2018. The first one in London, chaired by Baroness Honora O'Neill, discussed the concepts of trust and trustworthiness. We touched upon the question of the loss of trust, what counts as expertise, and what kinds of expertise can be distinguished. The content of the workshop has been published this week as a briefing in a first issue of the ALLEA discussion papers. ALLEA has already produced a video on this occasion introducing the working group and its main questions. It can be watched online. Thanks to our hosts, the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, it was possible to have a second workshop organized here in Sofia. Okay. Okay, that's nice. Thank you.
Don't touch the computer because
Okay, okay. And It took place yesterday. The participants discussed trust and trustworthiness in relation to scientific knowledge, production, and perspectives from different disciplines, from physics and humanities. We discussed the different attitudes to science and the role of values, beliefs, and emotions in doing so. Ethics came in not as a limit, but as a shaping asset in and for science. And we looked at a dramatically changed landscape of communication, especially the new dynamics of scholarly publishing. The third workshop will take place in Amsterdam on August 31 of this year, and it will be chaired by José van Dijk, the president of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. It will deal with the changing landscape of communication and the role of the new media and their effect on trust in science and expertise. We intend to publish the outcomes of the last two workshops, in the next issues of the ALLEA discussion papers. The three keynotes of today will refer to the three workshops and their themes. The first one, trust in experts, knowledge, advice and influence in environment policy by Susan Owens, Emeritus Professor of Environment and Policy in Cambridge, highlights the basic questions of trust and trustworthiness related to specific case with a long-term experience in independent scientific and political advice. Second keynote on European universities, how to generate trust in knowledge production by Antonio Loprieno, Professor of Egyptology and incoming President of ALLEA. The third keynote will be held by José van Dijk, President of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and distinguished Professor of Comparative Media Studies of Utrecht University. It's related to the third workshop, Changing Landscape of Communication, in August in Amsterdam. After, and that's more housekeeping, first content. After each keynote, two participants of the working group and invited guests will comment on the paper, and after it, the plenum will have the opportunity to comment, to make remarks, and to pose questions. Last but not least, after every round, there is a short break for tea and coffee, 20 minutes. Finally, in our communication on the theme of the symposium, we received a reaction of the Global Young Academy, a worldwide network of young scientists. As digital natives, so as they told themselves. Okay, thank you. They look for new means to regain trust and confidence in science. They proposed not only to communicate results of science, but to have an earlier and more personal outreach to the public. On their website, you will find videos of 1 minute where early career scientists tell why they do science, their fascinations, and their dreams. And I think it's a nice idea to start the symposium with only 2 of these presentations, hearing the next generation. So the first video will be of Lisa Herzog.
Scientists often understand themselves as producers of knowledge, but this producer mentality brings a market logic, and in a market logic you try to sell something, and it's not necessarily the case that you can trust the person who's trying to sell something. I think scientists need a professional logic of dealing with knowledge that includes a moral responsibility so that they can earn the trust that they want to have from society. So the question is really one of an ethos of science as serving society by generating specialized knowledge and then playing it back into society and taking responsibility for that particular area of knowledge and how it should be dealt with in society.
Thank you. And the second video is of Robert Lepenese.
The question whether there's a loss in science or expertise, I think, can be answered empirically depending on how you define trust and expertise. I think an important dynamic and a phenomenon that scientists need to take seriously is the way in which populists in policy, particularly right-wing populists, instrumentalize science and try to undermine science by giving very simple answers to complex social questions. Now, I think scientists must be wary not to go to the other extreme, and this extreme would be a technocratic approach to policy, which similarly often has only one solution to a complex problem. So the question is there parts of science that is doubted for good reason?
Okay, thank you. If you go to the website of the Global Young Academy, you will see there are 30 or more portraits with all people telling their fascination and their field and their study and why they think it's worth to spend their lives in science. Now, I would like to invite Susan Owens, and maybe the discussions come up here, and then Susan will have her keynote first, then the first comment, and then the scene is open to the public. Susan, do it.
Thank you very much, Presidents, Deputy Minister, friends and colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences today and an honour to be invited to deliver this talk. I hope you can hear me even if you can't see me. I'd like to start with a paradox. And the paradox is that the demand for evidence-based policy intensifies even as trust in expertise has seemed to decline. Wiebe Bijker and colleagues, in their fascinating account of the Health Council of the Netherlands, refer to this as the paradox of scientific authority. It's worth saying a word or two as well about expertise. Expertise takes many different forms. Experts are called upon to practice and advise in a wide range of contexts and for very different purposes. In my talk today, I'm going to focus on expert advisors in the context of policy making in modern democracies. I'm also going to draw from my own research on environmental governance and in particular on a very long-standing study of mine, a bit too long-standing for some of my colleagues, of one of the UK's longest-serving environmental advisory bodies, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. How should we define an expert? I offer a working definition, which will be elaborated on later. We might say an expert is an individual with in-depth knowledge and skills relating to a particular field, externally validated through qualifications, certification, peer recognition, and other widely accepted credentials. In my talk, I want to try to address three sets of issues. First of all, I'm going to offer some different models in the sense of representations of expertise and its relation to the policy-making process. In that part of the talk, I draw on a wide range of different disciplines, as well as on public and political discourse about experts. And just an observation, many disciplines have something to say about expertise and its relationship to policy. Often, however, on that subject, they haven't talked very much to each other. So there's a real challenge of bringing together the insights from different disciplines on the role of expertise. So how do we think about expertise? And when I say we, I mean we as citizens as well as scholars. Let me begin by offering two familiar but contrasting models about the role of expertise in decision-making. In the first of these models, which I think you will recognize, experts are represented as rational analysts, delivering dispassionate, authoritative advice for the guidance of those in power. It's a model which embodies a division of labour. The experts provide the evidence and the facts, and it falls to political actors to make judgments of value. This was well expressed by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in answering a question in the British House of Commons in 1989. I can't do the voice, but what she said was, "Advisers advise and ministers decide." I think this model is well known. There are three problems with it. First of all, over several decades, there's been an extensive and powerful critique of the basic premises of the model, of its conceptions of neutral expertise, and of its conceptions of the nature of policy-making processes. Secondly, it doesn't work. In the real world, it fails to persuade and convince. It doesn't bear much resemblance to what happens in actual interactions between experts and policymakers. In fact, as Stephen Turner argues in his recent book on the politics of expertise, little about this model is not misleading. I call this model the linear rational model of relations between experts and policymakers. The third problem, in a way, is that this model, despite the critiques and despite not reflecting reality very much, is extraordinarily tenacious. And we hear it rehearsed almost daily in one policy context or another. There's a very different model, but equally familiar. This is a model in which expert advice is seen as being used selectively and strategically to legitimize decisions or depoliticize contentious issues. Experts in this second model, let's call it the strategic model, are seen as political symbols, and their advice is often used as ammunition in policy conflicts. This model, too, is alive and well, I heard it a couple of weeks ago, for example, on BBC Radio 4's morning news programme, this is not from the morning news programme, this is actually from a letter to the Financial Times, which implicitly refers to this strategic model. According to the letter writer, the sorts of commissions that I've studied in depth are, and I quote, black holes to which politicians consign intractable problems, whose recommendations are invariably ignored by elected officials. So in this second model, this strategic model, policy is seen as having less to do with evidence than with what John Kingdon, the American political scientist, calls the balance of organised forces. It may be a bit more convincing than the linear rational model, but it's also problematic because it implies that knowledge doesn't really matter in the interplay of interests, institutions, and power. And that is not borne out by reality either. For example, if we look back over half a century of environmental policy, it would be absolutely inconceivable that we'd have the range of environmental policies that we have today without the important contributions of environmental science and other relevant forms of knowledge. Are there then some other ways of thinking about expertise in the policy process? If we look at a number of in-depth empirical investigations which have actually looked at how experts practice their expertise and interact with policymakers, then what we find is a set of much more subtle and complex interactions at this so-called interface between expertise and policy. We might find, for example, that experts act as agents of policy learning, synthesizing knowledge, developing ideas, framing or reframing problems, and articulating advice. They also act as boundary workers. They cultivate authority by constructing and defending the boundaries between science and non-science, following the ideas of Gearin in his seminal paper in 1983. But as well as constructing boundaries, experts simultaneously bridge them, skillfully framing their arguments and recommendations so that they make sense to both scientists and policymakers. It's important to recognise that these more subtle conceptions of the relationship between expertise and policymaking have both epistemic and discursive dimensions. In-depth knowledge and expertise in the traditional sense is of course required, but they also practice skillful framing, narrative, the making of judgments, and the building of trust as critical elements of the advisory process. As David Boucher put it in our workshop yesterday, reason and rhetoric are complementary, and what goes on in the world of expert advisory institutions is a very good demonstration of that. So, for example, according to Bijker and colleagues, the reports of the Health Council of the Netherlands actually contain a well-argued reflection on the state of knowledge in relation to the state of the world. And in my own research, I found that the Royal Commission's deliberations came closer to a form of practical public reasoning than to any technically oriented appraisal of the facts. So those are some different representations of expertise and its role in the policy process. I suggest that we might have now to acknowledge another way of thinking about experts, that experts are really not much use at all. This view was quite prominent, for example, in the UK referendum on whether or not to leave the EU. And we can still find it being expressed quite frequently. For example, and this is where I do come to the BBC's morning news programme, one discussant remarked a couple of weeks ago, "People don't want to hear from experts." That might be a rather extreme version of the idea that there's been a loss of trust in expertise, but nevertheless we need to think about why such ideas have become prevalent. And that takes me now to considering some of the evidence about whether there has or has not been a loss of trust in expertise. And I'm just going to touch on a number of different sources of such evidence, but I warn you that they represent a very tangled web of conflicting interpretations. So we could look, for example, at what people actually do, people's behaviour. And in that case, I think we must agree with Baroness Honora O'Neill, who argues that in their routine activities, people constantly place trust in many others. They actually do trust others on a daily basis. But we should also note the comment by Tom Nichols in his recent book, The Death of Expertise, when he says that such routine trust is a prosaic matter of necessity and is not the same thing as trusting professionals when it comes to matters of public policy. We can look also at opinion polls. For example, the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index was published again in November last year, and it shows, in fact, that scientists and professors, hurrah, do rather well in such polls. They come out much better than politicians, for example. And if we look at a series of such polls over time, that tends to suggest that professors and scientists are more trusted now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. But we have to be cautious about opinion polls. Typically, they provide snapshots of what people think at a particular moment in time, which may be influenced by many factors. They are very dependent on the specific questions asked. They don't tell us how people form their views and their values, and they also don't tell us whether people's trust in professors and experts is actually well placed. We might take encouragement from the empirical observation that public interest in science is very high. For example, if we look at the popularity of television documentaries about nature or about astronomy, there's great public enthusiasm. David Attenborough's BBC series Blue Planet 2 was the most watched programme in the UK in 2017, with an audience of more than 14 million people. Closely followed, but not quite pipped at the post, by the next most popular programme, which was Strictly Come Dancing. There is, however, countervailing evidence. Of great concern to all of us is the increasing production and consumption of misinformation and the kind of fake news that's already been mentioned, particularly in the digital media. I'm not going to dwell on that because Jose van Dijk will talk about it later this afternoon. But I fully acknowledge that this is a very worrying trend with serious implications for trust in expertise. I would also argue that it needs urgently to be disentangled from legitimate critique of expert claims. And that's very important because, and here I move on to another apparent source of evidence about trust or not in expertise. The apparent rejection of some forms of technoscience seems to reinforce the notion of declining trust in scientists and other experts. So we see, for example, a public uneasiness about particular forms of scientific inquiry. We see challenges to expert claims in science policy controversies. And we see resistance to certain technological developments, as with some biotechnologies, for example, or fracking, certainly currently a big issue in the UK. I would argue that it would be misguided to reach sweeping conclusions about trust in expertise or about, and I put this in quotation marks, public misunderstandings of science from such challenges that we now witness. I suggest that it's very important, crucial for us in the academies and elsewhere to distinguish, on the one hand, willful misinformation and unwarranted rejection of established knowledge from, on the other hand, legitimate questioning of expert claims or particular directions of travel in science and technology. After all, as Tom Nichols also argues in his book, reasoned skepticism is essential not only to science but also to a healthy democracy. Let me finish this second section of my talk with the observation that mistrust, or at least a degree of skepticism about expertise, may, as one of our younger scientists claimed, be well placed. There are a number of reasons for us to be cautious about placing our trust. Let's set aside for now the phenomenon which I think is not common but does exist, the phenomenon of rogue experts. Let's set that aside. But there might be other reasons to be a bit sceptical. One is that experts are not omnipotent and they get things wrong. The second is that they don't much resemble the neutral, disinterested advisors of the linear rational model of relations between expertise and policy. As David Kennedy argues in his book, A World of Struggle, we should see expert knowledge as human knowledge, a blend of conscious, semi-conscious, and wholly unconscious ideas, full of tensions and contradictions, inhabited by people who have projects and who think, speak, and act strategically. And a further reason for a degree of skepticism is something pointed out also by Stephen Turner. Experts almost by definition have competence in a particular field, usually quite narrowly circumscribed. But experts don't always have what Turner calls competence. That is the competence to recognize when they've reached the limits of their competence. And then finally in this section there's the crucial question of framing. Expert claims will be rejected when the questions being addressed by the experts are not the questions that people actually care about. As the UK House of Lords Science and Technology Committee argued in a very well-received report about science and society, some issues treated by decision makers as scientific issues involve many other factors besides science. Framing the problem wrongly by excluding moral, social, ethical, and other concerns invites hostility. Despite all these complexities, and I come now to the final section of my talk, I believe it is possible to identify factors that generate well-placed trust of and trustworthiness of experts. First of all, we have the attributes and the practices of expert advisors themselves. What kinds of attributes generate trust? There's an enormous amount to be said here, and I can use only a few examples. But the body that I studied, the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, was, for the 40 or so years of its existence, and for the most part, a trusted body. So what did it do? How did it behave in order to be trusted? And it seems that amongst its most important attributes in that respect were authority, by which I'm referring to epistemic authority, and autonomy, which one civil servant described to me as the independence thing. But these attributes can't simply be proclaimed. They must actively be constructed and maintained over periods of time. And there are different ways in which this is done by advisory bodies. As Stephen Hillgartner reminds us, an advisory body must assert, cultivate, and guard its own authority, and indeed its independence. Furthermore, such characteristics must be conferred upon the body by others, including governments, as well as believed in by itself. And thirdly, we must see affirmation of attributes like authority and autonomy in real material outcomes over time. In other words, the body must be shown to have effect, or nobody will trust it anymore. All of those requirements seemed to hold for the commission that I studied, and they held in part because as an advisory body, it engaged in a range of both epistemic and discursive practices. I have time probably for only one example of these, but it is a rather interesting example. And it relates back to the point I made earlier about advisors acting as boundary workers. Interestingly, the Commission acquired epistemic authority by positioning itself and by being positioned by others as a scientific body. If you like, it gained a lot of numinous legitimacy, and occasionally its life was saved by the fact that it was seen as a scientific body. But there's a very interesting twist to this source of authority, because in fact the Commission was a much more heterogeneous body whose members, usually numbering about 14, embraced a wide range of disciplines: natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. It was this breadth of expertise, in addition to the epistemic authority of individual members, that enabled the Commission to adopt what I call its sort of signal practice of interdisciplinary deliberation. And it was through that interdisciplinary deliberation that it became both reflective on what it was doing and reflexive in sometimes changing its conception of what it was working on. And that helped it very much to produce robust, skillfully framed reports. Milena Ziegfurs asked yesterday in our workshop whether synergy between different disciplines, different kinds of knowledge, is a way of increasing trustworthiness. And I can say that in the case of this body that I examined in depth, yes, that synergy was certainly a very important way of increasing trustworthiness. The other things that it did, which I don't have time to go into in depth, was that it fiercely guarded and practiced its own independence. For example, it chose its own subjects for investigation, sometimes very inconveniently for the government. It resisted bureaucratic and political interference, and it was determined always not to be, in any sense, an arm of government at all, as one civil servant put it to me. In challenging conventional frames in many of its reports, it exhibited a certain fearlessness in the delivery of its advice, and that too helped it to be trustworthy. Very briefly, let me say something about the institutional processes through which advice is sought and delivered, because that too relates to the attributes of trust and trustworthiness. All I can do here is raise some questions. Is the system open or closed, transparent or opaque? Are those seeking advice prepared to be robustly challenged, or do they wish only to have their views reinforced? Some of the Commission's most effective reports in causing long-lasting changes to environmental policy were extremely disruptive, and the advice was very unwelcome in the short term, but nevertheless it was the most effective in the longer term. We might ask also, in what sense are the advisors themselves accountable? But a note of caution on this, on these institutional processes through which trust might be generated. There are some significant tensions between, for example, openness, transparency, and providing space for an advisory body to deliberate. There is also a tension between autonomy, remaining fully independent and being fearless in offering your advice, and accountability, at least of the more mechanistic, box-ticking variety. I note here that in my research, when I was asking people why they trusted the Commission, they nearly always referred to its independence and hardly ever to its accountability. Let me finish with a few remarks about the political context for advice and the nature, or including the nature, of the issues being considered. Because in certain circumstances, the questions that arise about expertise, trustworthiness, and trust are particularly challenging. This is the case, for example, in my field of environmental governance, and it's particularly acute in areas of environmental risk. In these sorts of controversial areas, some or all of the following nearly always apply. Evidence is almost always incomplete, and profound uncertainties and ignorance, unknown unknowns, abound. Both of those can be reduced by further research, but they probably can't ever be eliminated, given the complexity of the environmental systems involved and of human-environment interactions. These issues are also characterized typically by high economic and political stakes, so they're fraught issues. They're characterized by, or rather the underlying issues, are grounded in divergent values and beliefs. And what's so interesting about this divergence is that the different world views on these issues don't divide neatly along familiar lines of experts and the public on the different sides. Rather, we find informed people of goodwill, scientists as well as policymakers, journalists, civil society organisations and others, on both sides of these debates. All of these characteristics take us firmly into the realm of regulatory or post-normal science, where we can't reasonably expect controversies to be settled by the facts. How then do we talk about experts and their role in the policy process? We might want to say, I often want to say, that good evidence is defensible evidence. But in many environmental controversies, the defensibility of the evidence itself becomes bound up inextricably with the conflict. So I conclude with a suggestion, but I think it is now well supported by social scientific research on actual advisory practices in real-world policy processes. And that is that in these difficult situations where the issues are contested, the most effective expert advice may involve the purposeful and constructive hybridization of science and politics. Thank you very much.
Now we will have the first two comments. And the first speaker is Professor Boris Krasnadov, Professor of Philosophy here at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And the second is Professor Katarine Holst, Professor of Sociology of the University of Oslo. So, Boris, you will start. You can take the mic here. You can. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ed. First, I would like to thank Susan for a very, very interesting paper. And I've been thinking about it since yesterday when I read it for a second time. And there are two things I would like to do in this comment. The first one is to pick up where you ended with your suggestion, and then, if that permits, I would like to ask not more than two questions. Perhaps I'll be really happy if we have the chance to have a very, very short discussion.
Interrupt a moment.
Sure.
Can you understand the speaking here, there, at the end of the room?
Do I speak loudly enough?
Yes?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
You're welcome. Okay. First, I believe that given the rich structure of the problematics you so clearly sketch here in the paper, your suggestion at the end of the paper for the hybridization of science and politics sounds like a really natural one, and in my opinion, like a very good one. So I have to say that I agree, if not completely, to a great extent with the suggestion. But I'm a bit skeptical about the prospects of implementing, of achieving this suggestion. And I believe that probably most of the people in this room, scientists and politicians, administrators of science, would see exactly what I mean. It's not the news. When it comes to trust in experts, or at the end of the day, when it comes to trust in the scientific knowledge, there are perhaps three possible attitudes towards it. You sketched all of them in the paper. The first one is the trust of the society in general, in experts and in scientific knowledge. We are well aware that this trust, no matter the rise during recent years, faces various problems, and you mentioned some of them. I would add another problem which I believe I didn't hear in the structure, and it is the following. When the value of scientific knowledge and the value of science declines in the value system of the society in general, then of course it's great to have successful popularity of science, and I have to say that this popularity of TV shows, digital media, even books is understandably but unfortunately a popular science popularity, which is great. I mean, I try to do popular science myself, and I believe this is one of the routes to educate and to inspire the interest in the society in science. But of course we have to distinguish between popular science and hardcore science. And it is from the hardcore science where the true knowledge stems and advices whether experts or other people should take from. So I'm not extremely optimistic about the dynamics of the value of scientific knowledge in societies. Now, of course, there are different societies, and of course, there are differences across societies. In the UK, I saw one attitude towards scientists. In the US, very close, still a bit different. In my home country, Bulgaria, trust me, very different attitude towards science and towards people who do science for a living. So I'm a bit skeptical how the value system within the society in general could back up this suggestion as a large basis. Second possible attitude is obviously the attitude of professional scientists towards what they do, towards the scientific knowledge itself. Now, yesterday, Luke Drury mentioned something in his really, really interesting for me presentation, that it is the scientists themselves or ourselves who question the most and mercilessly the procedure and the results. And that's the way it's got to be, obviously. Question is, how good are we at this? From what I heard yesterday, physicists are way ahead from some perhaps other sciences, but maybe it's a good model which other sciences, especially social sciences and humanities, and I come from humanities and social sciences, can take. So I believe that this attitude is probably the most prominent. I believe that scientists would manage sooner or later to achieve the balance that would allow them as a scientific general global community to not to sell, but to put forward in a successful way the scientific knowledge. Now, the third and the last attitude is, unfortunately or fortunately, but what can we do, the attitude of the administration and the governing bodies towards the advices of scientists and scientific knowledge. Now, the two models and your comments were, I mean, I completely agree that this is roughly what we observe in the modern society as possible attitudes and possible and actual dynamics towards the advice of experts and scientific knowledge. But here I'm again a bit skeptical, and I believe that probably we share in a way this skepticism as scientists. My personal observation, and I believe I don't speak only for myself here, is that no matter how good the expert is, no matter how right she is, no matter how clearly the advice is given to the politician, because obviously not all politicians are scientists, and obviously it is a technical challenge to understand exactly what a professional scientist is telling you, what's happening. I mean, if Professor Dury goes to a politician who is not a physicist, I mean, he's capable of lucidly explaining the things, but let's not fool ourselves. Physics is a difficult matter. So even if the politician has the best of intentions to act accordingly from a benevolent normative basis, so that she or he tries to use the professional advice for the best of the society, then reality is that he or she might not understand the implications of this small or bigger portion of scientific knowledge. So here I'm again skeptical. And to conclude, because I believe that I'm taking too much time, I want to connect this with your suggestion and my questions. Obviously, the way to go is, you call it hybridization of science and politics, and to some extent we do have this, obviously. The question is it realistic to expect not full but sufficiently rich hybridization of science and politics? Say 50% of politicians, power places, are professional scientists, not with degrees, but people who have suffered the scientific enterprise. Would such people be electable? I mean, we cannot tell the people whom to elect. We can vote, we can do advertisements and stuff, but we have no power. I mean, scientists, we have no non-people power over this democratic election process. So I'm not sure, actually I'm a bit skeptical that it is possible to achieve sufficiently rich balance of this hybrid model. Now, I vote with all my heart for this, obviously. I'm just a bit skeptical. And I believe that when we look at the differences between societies, you will see that some societies are much more prone to this model to occur than others. And unfortunately, even within Europe, our countries seems to differ in a non-trivial way, unfortunately, in the behavior in the actions of the government and the society in general towards this hybridization. So that's my first question, and then just to sound a bit more positive, perhaps, and then I conclude that. Okay.
Will you add directly?
Yeah, I have something in writing.
Okay, please. Yes.
Didn't you have another question?
I do. It's the last one I finished. Yeah.
I would like to have another discussion room and charge to include the whole public. So afterwards,
At the discussion, sure.
The possibility. Yeah? No? Yeah, take it.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me as discussant. First, I must also confess that I have no genuine quarrels with Susan Owen's extremely subtle and thoughtful treatment of the topic under investigation. I think she precisely captured the role of expert advice in contemporary policy making. She neither over nor underestimates the problem of diminished trust in experts, and she lists, interestingly, some characteristics of an expert commission that people have tended to trust. I have prepared 3 remarks, mostly to be regarded as additions to Susan Owen's presentations. First, I wanted to present some features of the expert advice commissions I myself do research on, namely the Nordic-style temporary advisory commissions. Secondly, I will say a little bit about the democratic concern often raised in discussions of experts' political role. And thirdly, will I argue that some kind of rational model of expert advice may not be such a bad thing if we make sure to define what the rational approach means in a sensible manner. So first, a remark on the Nordic-style committees. Just like the Commission Professor Owens presented us for, these committees are highly trusted. They are generally regarded as well-functioning and with high legitimacy. They are also committees where scientists and academic knowledge play a central role. These committee systems have furthermore a long history, going back to the 19th century, and are regarded as a vital part of the Nordic governance model. The committees in question are typically temporary and not permanent. They work for 1 to 2 years, synthesizing knowledge in some area, formulating policy recommendations, and sometimes drafting legislation. They are relied on in the policy formulation phase across policy areas, from economic policy and foreign policy to labor market policy, family policy, health policy, environmental policy. Many of these committees are also influential as agenda setters, establishing the knowledge basics, framing policy problems, and suggesting measures and tools to solve them. Yet, in contrast to the Commission Professor Owens just spoke of, these committees, at least up until recently, have been so-called hybrid committees. They have consisted typically of a critical mass of scientists, but also of civil servants and interest group representatives. The high level of trust in these committees is thus not due, seemingly, to a specifically scientific image. Rather, what people seem to put trust in is the way these committees combine competence and compromise between different societal interests. Recent findings from our research on these committees show, moreover, that scientists and academics play an increasing role in these committees. There is a significant increase in the amount of scientists around the committee tables and among the committee chairs. Notably, this growing role of scientists and academic knowledge does not seem to have increased public trust. Rather, the developments have spurred a more pronounced public criticism of experts taking over policymaking, experts becoming more powerful in our society, etc. At the same time, there is reason to argue that the epistemic quality of the committee's deliberations and reports have increased as a result of the growing role of scientists, to the extent that we are able to study and measure this, of course. So one interpretation of such findings is that increased epistemic quality and increased public trust do not necessarily go together, so that delicate trade-offs may be needed. Moreover, also in contrast to the Commission Susan Owens describes, these committees have been highly trusted even if the bureaucratic control has been and still is considerable. The ministry in charge selects members and chairs of the committees, formulate mandates, civil servants serve as committee members and dominate the committee secretariats. So independence from bureaucratic regulation is not a necessary condition, seemingly, for public trust in expert advice arrangements. Regulations must, however, be of a kind that do not compromise the experts' independence to deliberate freely and to apply their knowledge as they see most fit. Also, for these committees, agenda-setting power, their relatively close links to bureaucracy may not have been such a bad thing, or this at least is something we should discuss. Civil servants have supported the committees with supplemented the committees with important regulatory expertise and ensured, in many cases, a more effective implementation of the committee's recommendations. Second remark, briefer. Susan Owens emphasizes rightly that there are legitimate reasons not to have blind trust in experts, since it is well known how experts make mistakes and can be biased in the range of ways. In addition to this, there is a legitimate democratic concern. Experts' agenda-setting power in policymaking gives them extra political power, and this extra power to experts may come into conflict with democratic norms of political equality and equal participation. This legitimate democratic concern should not make us too dismissive of experts. Are we to formulate sound public policies? We need, I think, to rely on input from experts as well as from other sources. The democratic concern must, however, somehow be addressed. Some scholars have suggested that expertise itself must be democratized, and institutionalizing lay participation and influence in expert bodies may sometimes work well. But it must be done with care so the epistemic qualities of expert advice are not compromised. Another way would be to increase participatory credentials elsewhere in the political system. Maybe the problem is not so much that the obviously limited democratic merits of expert bodies and committees, but rather that party democracy seems to degenerate in many countries, that civil society is becoming less vibrant, etc. Finally, a third remark I would also try to make brief on whether we need a rational approach or model for expertise and expert advice. We must first, of course, distinguish between empirical and normative considerations, because even if our current practices are not particularly rational, we can, of course, try and want to make them more rational. Whether this is a good idea or not depends naturally immensely on how you define rational. And I agree completely with Susan Owens that the idea of experts as providers of pure evidence is a flawed idea and not something we should strive for. What we should strive for, however, is to organize expert advice arrangements in ways that are reasonable and that give adequate scope to reason-giving, deliberation and epistemic concerns. And in this connection, two concerns that Owens aptly raised should be highlighted in particular. First, there is every reason to think that cognitive diversity in expert committees result in better deliberations and recommendations. Epistemic monism and dominance by one or few disciplines will over time be a problem for the quality of expert advice and so for the quality of our policies. This is why we in our research on the Nordic-style advisory committees have raised concerns over the steep increase in the amount of economists in the committees. We certainly do need economists' advice when designing policies, but economics is not all there is. And secondly, any expert committee will be confronted at some point with moral problems and broader societal concerns. Policy issues rarely, if ever, are purely technical. We need this, thus to have our experts trained, not only in their narrow field, but also so they are able to deal with moral and social concerns in ways that are viable, reasonable, and trustworthy. Yes.
Thank you. Susan will give a short reaction to the both questions and statements, and then the discussion is open to the public.
Okay, well, those are absolutely fantastic comments and questions, and Ed has instructed me to give short responses, which is a bit of an impossibility, but I agree with a great deal of what has been said. I could stop there, but I will make some comments. So, in response to Boris's point, or Boris's skepticism about the value of hybridization, I agree that it's complex and difficult. I want to emphasize that it doesn't in any sense at all undervalue the contributions of both science and politics. It's not in any sense saying that science is less valued. What I would observe, though, is that when people, including myself, but Catherine and Sheila Jasinoff and many others, the Babaika and colleagues, have actually taken a long look at advisory systems in practice, actually working. When you talk to people, do documentary analysis and all other sorts of things, hybridization is not just an aspiration, It is actually an empirical observation of what is making the most effective advice work in practice. So I think it's important to recognize that it is in fact through research that we have evidence that when advisors employ both epistemic and quite sophisticated discursive strategies, their advice is more effective. I just wanted to say a little bit about, you raised some questions about the relations between scientific advisors and policymakers, including politicians. I have thought for a long time that greater humility is perhaps needed on both sides of these relationships. And whilst I think we quite often say it would be good if policymakers had a better understanding of science. I think that's true. It would be better if all of us had a better understanding of science, or everyone. It's less frequently heard that scientists ought to have a better understanding of policy and political processes. And frankly, some of the expressions I've heard in many, many meetings, some interpretations of policy processes are the social science equivalent of thinking that the sun goes round the earth. And the relationship needs to work both ways. I've been involved in another study with a colleague, James Palmer, where we've looked at, again, at actual advisory practices, in this case, the UK system of having a chief scientific advisor in every government department, which on the whole works rather well. And one of the most important things that goes on there is that trust is built between the advisor and the politicians that he or she is advising. And those relationships of trust have turned out to be, I'm tempted to say, almost as important as the quality of the scientific advice that's being given to the policymaker. I think those are the main points that I wanted to make. I'm sure I can discuss at much greater length, Boris, with you some of the things you raised. Catherine also raised very important issues. I think, I meant to say it, but I didn't have time, that the linear, rational and strategic models that I outlined at the beginning of my talk, they are in a sense caricatures, but they're quite lasting caricatures. What I would argue is that we do, in fact, if we look at environmental decision making, for example, of course we see elements of both of those, depending on the issue. So I like to think, actually, that some sort of hybrid of advisors acting as agents of policy learning and acting as boundary workers does not preclude, in certain circumstances, a rational analytic approach or a strategic approach. Certainly on a number of occasions, the Royal Commission that I studied was used strategically by ministers. There's no doubt about that. But certainly when it was first formed in 1970, the intent was a rational analytical body. I'll ask Ed's indulgence and give a minute example. When the Commission wrote a very important report on lead in petrol in 1983, it produced no new scientific evidence, but in contrast to previous advice and to the government's established position, it said, get lead out of petrol quickly. And by then the government was in a very difficult position. The run-up to a general election, the opposition had accepted that lead should be got out of petrol. That report was the fastest ever accepted advice. Quite a radical recommendation. It was accepted within 35 minutes. of the Royal Commission making it, accepted by ministers. And when I interviewed people, they could remember ministers running down the corridors of Whitehall, waving the Royal Commission report, saying, we've got it, we've got it. It enabled the government to do a U-turn without changing, without losing faith. That is strategic use of advice, but nevertheless it didn't undervalue the very skillful framing of the Commission's report in that context. So I don't think we should lose all aspiration for rational analytical advice, of course. It's just that in practice it isn't just a presentation of facts, but a lot of other activities as well. You mentioned that the Nordic committees were more hybrid in that they include some policymakers. And I'm well aware that that's a very interesting model and a different model. However, the Commission, in a sense, had some elements of that too, because until the late 1990s, at any one time, at least one of its members was also a member of the House of Lords and therefore a parliamentarian. And that direct link into the legislature was actually very important to the Commission. It also included at any one time 2 or 3 members with backgrounds in different sectors like industry or agriculture. So it wasn't an entirely academic body, though it was sometimes criticised as being too academic. And then on the very interesting point you raise about independence, of course there were multiple opportunities for bureaucratic meddling with the Commission. There were opportunities for political interference. My argument is not that those opportunities didn't exist. And in fact, the members of the Commission were chosen by the ministry, sometimes in consultation with other ministries, and then actually had to be approved by the Prime Minister. 1 or 2 Prime Ministers are reported not to have approved a few members every now and again. And in fact, of course, they're appointed by the Queen. And all the reports went first to the Queen, or at least the Queen had to have been in a room in which the reports were present, apparently. But my point is that the Commission exercised a functional independence in its actual practices. That it didn't, every now and again governments tried to interfere a bit with reports, and it sent them packing every time. It chose subjects that the government was horrified by on some occasions. And in that sense, and in that, the actual drafting of its reports, it demonstrated a functional independence. I could go on, but I won't, because editing. But I'd like to thank both commentators very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
So there is... Well, you have heard the paper, you have heard the commentators and the answer. Who has a question? Who wants to make a remark? Please. Oh yeah, and use the mics. There are mics here and everywhere, but...
Yes, I'm Ali Alpar from the Science Academy, Turkey. I'd like to raise the question of education. So for future generations to bring about a medium of understanding between scientists and policymakers, I think it is worthwhile to think about what can be done in education, and starting from primary school level. My concern would be about scientific literacy of children who are going to be in professions based on social science and humanities. The other side also needs a lot more to be done, but it's more traditional for people going into technical scientific professions to have, in the name of general culture, some courses, some education humanities. And when I mean, when I say scientific literacy, I don't just mean the ability to follow the findings of science, but to be exposed in some very simple level to the way a scientist thinks and works. And I think this is a very worthwhile thing to start doing, and I think it's probably feasible to do it in creative ways, starting from primary school education. And I'd like a comment on this, because popular science was mentioned in the discursive aspect, but not much was said about science education in general. Thank you.
You want to answer directly?
Thank you. That's a very important question. It raises. Better. Light. Okay. Better. Yes. Thank you very much. In education, certainly in our system in the UK, we increasingly create specialists. So all through the system, people are becoming more and more specialists. I think there's a deeper question as well, which is that in some sense, sometimes, if you look at C.P. Snow, for example, science has sometimes been counterpoised with culture. I used to serve as a social scientist on the Royal Society's Science Policy Advisory Group. And I was very impressed at that time by the determination of the Royal Society to try to engender an attitude whereby science was a crucial part of our culture and not something separate from it. And I agree very much about not just understanding certain things about science, but also understanding scientific method and why it's so important. So in that sense, I agree with your call for literacy, but I think also almost equally, I'd like to see people who are literate in the workings of democratic institutions, how they go about their business, how decisions are made, why sometimes they have to be decisions that they don't like, and so on, and indeed across the range. When it comes to university level education, I think that we have more challenges, because in a sense we are trying to make people specialists in their field. I can only say that I've met a number of people who graduated in natural sciences from my own university, who've also, in their fourth year, done a course in the history and philosophy of science, and that doesn't apply to all of our scientists, and I think that's tremendously useful. I think, again, you know, there should be some way of introducing every scientist to some of the basics of politics and policy making, and people also in the humanities and social sciences into some of the basics of science. How you do it in crowded curricula, I think, is a challenge, but it's perhaps one that the academies can rise to.
Okay. We still have the opportunity for one question. Yes? Over.
I just want to make maybe a slightly provocative mark here at the end. I question actually the sentence written up there, the loss of trust in science. I don't think there is a loss of trust in what I would call real science. The fact is, of course, that we trust, all of us, things that work. And so none of us distrust engineering science. We go in the aircraft, we are 100% confident that it works. Vaccination programs in this world have been fantastically successful, and the public understands that. There is a grey scale, and certain types of science have perhaps not been as trusted for good reasons. Economic predictions have turned out in many cases to be totally wrong. So in many ways, I think the public is not that wrong when advice is given in areas where actually there is not solid evidence. It is perfectly natural that one should be very, very skeptical. And we as scientists have still to remember that the most important thing for the trustworthiness of science is that the science is of good quality, that it is reproducible, and that it actually works.
Okay. Comment?
Am I still? Yes, I completely agree, and I hope I didn't give an impression that I believe there's a wholesale loss of trust in science. I absolutely don't think that. I think we, as I said, we can find certain kinds of pointers that suggest some loss of trust in some kinds of science and related technologies. But I also think that what Jose van Dijk is going to talk about is something a bit different. It's about what's happening in digital media where certain groupings don't really trust anyone except other people in their particular echo chamber, and that's rather different. Somebody in our workshop yesterday, it might have been you say, who said it was a kind of nihilistic lack of trust in anybody, and that's something very different. But I really don't think we should fall into the trap of interpreting questioning of science or skepticism about particular directions of development as signaling a general loss of trust in science. I think that would be wrong. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I have to stop here now the first round, but you know we have 20 minutes of coffee, so you can attack the speakers and the commentators next to the coffee. At the end, we have still some more time, so there is more space for questions, but I want to start the second round in 20 minutes. So please, the coffee, and thank you all for your speeches and comments. Thank you.